So my name is Duncan Green and I'm Strategic Advisor at Oxfam, Great Britain. I think if I'm going to talk about faith organisations, I should start off by saying I'm an atheist, but I spent many years in Latin America. I worked on social movements in Latin America, I wrote about Latin America, and then I worked with the Catholic aid agency CAFOD. So I became a kind of fellow traveller. I could see the importance and the effectiveness of faith organisations. I suppose my starting point in thinking about faith organisations is the research on how poor people see their lives shows absolutely without doubt that the institutions that they most relate to, that they most trust, the institutions that help form their values and their ways of seeing the world are faith organisations. So it's always struck me as profoundly odd that development practitioners are so secular. The aid business talks about evidence-based policy making. It doesn't talk about faith-based policy making. It has a sort of Enlightenment, secular, rational worldview, which means it's automatically alien to the majority of the people we're claiming to be working for and with. So I think there's a profound contradiction in the secularism that's so deeply rooted in the aid business. A couple of examples of that. So we're now at the 10th anniversary of the giant Asian tsunami. One of the more interesting episodes for Oxfam after the tsunami was we went to one particular village, I think in Aceh, and said, what is it that would most help you rebuild from this terrible catastrophe? And the village had a discussion, had a vote, and they said, we want you to rebuild our mosque. Our mosque has been destroyed. And of course, awkward for a largely secular organisation like Oxfam, wasn't sure whether this was an appropriate use of our funds. So the fudge in the end was, yes, we'll fund you to rebuild your mosque as long as you call it a community centre. And sure enough, they went ahead and that village got back on its feet faster than the villages in the immediate neighbourhood, quite possibly because they actually had a social centre. It did act as a community centre, but it was a bit odd that we couldn't actually bring ourselves to acknowledge that it was also a mosque. So that's one example. I think another example is working on women's rights in majority Muslim countries, or even in majority Christian countries. The interesting thing in Oxfam is that we seem much better at working on this in Muslim contexts than in Christian ones. So in Muslim contexts, we've engaged with Islamic feminists. We've engaged with the theological studies of what the Quran actually says about women's rights. We've done some really interesting women's rights work in places like Mindanao in the Philippines or in Yemen on early marriage. And we've got a sort of body of knowledge about how you work respectfully with a very important faith institution in which there are many different currents. So another of the problems, the mistakes that aid organisations make is thinking that a church is monolithic, Islam is monolithic. There are always currents, there are always feminists, there are always pro or anti rights of any given kind. So it's a question about understanding how the power works inside that institution, finding allies, finding common ground and being respectful. Interestingly, I think we sometimes find it harder to do that with the Christian churches. There was a moment in the Philippines where our excellent team were explaining to me this great work they're doing on women's rights in Mindanao. And I said, well, that's great. But that's only 3% of the Filipino population. What are you doing with the Catholic Church, which is instrumental in sexual and reproductive rights, in forming norms and attitudes towards women and women's rights? And they said, no, we're not going to work with those people, because we're all lapsed Catholics and we can't abide talking to them. And so there was a real, the penny dropped. Oh, okay, I see. So as long as it's the other, we can work with it. But if it's too close to us and it's something we've rejected, we have a problem. So I think there's all sorts of interesting things going on around the way that aid business relates to faith organisations, and we have to get over ourselves and actually engage.